Hi everyone. Today we're going to look at the story of the Exodus, and we're going to look at it through the lens of reception history. Specifically, we're going to look at the story of the deliverance of the Israelite nation at the Red Sea. So let me read part of the passage that's found in Exodus chapters 13 through 15. When the Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer, for God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of the land of Egypt, prepared for battle. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people, and they said, "What have we done, letting Israel leave our service?" So he had his chariots made ready, and took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites, who were going out boldly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his chariot drivers and his army. They overtook them camped by the sea. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of the Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians and upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Okay, so that's the story of the deliverance of the Israelites at the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, as it says in Hebrew. And like I said, we're going to look at this through the lens of reception history. Now, what is reception history? Reception history is a type of reader response theory. It emphasizes the interaction and interpretation of a text by different audiences. So what happens is, as different audiences through time read the same text, they derive meaning from the text, but they also give meaning to the text. And so it's kind of like a conversation between the text and the audience that really leads to a transformation of both text and audience. So reception history traces the ways in which a text has been received by different audiences in different times and places. And the story of the Exodus is a particularly good example of this, because there are more numerous examples than I will have time to list today, but I'll give you a few examples. The story of the Exodus is in many ways the founding myth. And I use the term myth here in the technical sense that's used in religious studies. A myth is a story that involves deep truths and sometimes involves encounters with the divine. So it is the founding myth of Israel as a nation, as opposed to a distinct people. The founding or the origin of Israel as a distinct people goes back to the Abraham stories we've already looked at. But the founding of Israel as a nation goes back to this Exodus event. The Israelites had been slaves in Egypt. They were led out by Moses after a series of displays of divine power. We've talked about this already earlier. The Pharaoh pursues them, but God miraculously delivers them by drowning the Egyptian army in the Sea of Reeds. And after the Israelites have already walked safely through on dry land. This Exodus story is actually similar to a number of other stories from the ancient Near East, particularly stories that derive from the land of Canaan, that is, the promised land that the Israelites were going to enter. And so there's a Ugaritic myth, for example, of Baal or Baal and Yam. Yam is a Canaanite and Hebrew word that means sea. And so Baal, the god of the Canaanites, fights against the sea and defeats it. And there's other stories that are similar to these, and many of these stories are actually referenced in passing in parts of the Hebrew Bible. So one example that I'm going to look at for how that shows us how the Exodus story was received comes from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 51, verses 9 through 11. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces? And Rahab here is a reference to the nation of Egypt. It's often used as a metaphor for Egypt, but it's also used sometimes as a sea monster. So it could be either one. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to cross over? So in the book of Isaiah, the Exodus is referenced as a past historical event, but it's being reinterpreted as an event for the Israelites leaving their Babylonian captivity and returning to the land of Israel. So it is a reinterpretation of the Exodus story. It's sort of a new Exodus. Later Jewish retellings of the Exodus story sometimes emphasize God's role, and sometimes they put more emphasis on Moses' role. Another example of the reinterpretation of this story is during the Maccabean Revolt in the 2nd century BCE. Judas Maccabeus, the leader of the revolt, used the Exodus story as a rallying cry for his followers who were fighting the Greek Seleucid king named Antiochus Epiphanes. He referred back to Moses' leadership and God's support of the Israelite nation, and he refers to the story in order to give the Israelites courage to fight what on paper at least would have, or maybe parchment, would have seemed to be superior forces of Antiochus Epiphanes. The New Testament also refers to the Exodus event and reinterprets it. So, for example, in Matthew chapter 2, this is part of the Nativity story, Matthew's version of the Nativity story, the birth of Jesus. Matthew tells the story that after Jesus was born, his family fled from Bethlehem into Egypt in order to escape the threats that were posed to the baby Jesus by Herod the Great. And then after Herod dies, the Holy Family, Mary and Joseph and Jesus, return from Egypt. And Matthew quotes a passage from Hosea chapter 11:1, which itself refers to the Exodus. Hosea 11:1 says, "Out of Egypt did I call my son." And so Matthew basically is saying that Jesus and his family, the Holy Family's return from Egypt to the land of Israel, is like another Exodus, like a new Exodus. All right. The Gospel of Luke also refers to the Exodus event. When Jesus is on what's called the Mount of Transfiguration with three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, they see a vision where Jesus is talking to Moses and Elijah, and Jesus is talking with them, and they're discussing Jesus' imminent death that is going to take place in Jerusalem. It's a reference to his crucifixion and also to the resurrection. And the word that's used in that passage specifically is that Jesus says that Jesus was talking about his exodos. That's the Greek word, where we get our word Exodus from, his departure. And so it, again, is a reinterpretation of that passage. The church father Origen in the 3rd century, he saw the Exodus story. He saw the sea in the Exodus story, the Red Sea, as a prefiguration of baptism. All right, so that's one way that he took it. The Anglo-Saxons, who moved from the European continent onto the island of Britain in the Middle Ages after their conversion to Christianity, they looked back at their journey and they saw their journey to Britain as a type of Exodus. Also in Britain, there was a guy named Geoffrey of Monmouth who wrote a book called The History of the Kings of Britain, which, by the way, is one of the earliest mentions of King Arthur is in this book. But Geoffrey of Monmouth describes a settling of Britain by a Roman named Brutus in terms of the Exodus. Pope Urban II, who issued a call for Christians to go to the Holy Land to recapture Jerusalem, the First Crusade, in other words, he uses the imagery of the Exodus when urging soldiers to go off and retake the Holy Land. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, saw the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VII as Moses, who would deliver the Italians from the oppression of the Egyptians. Okay, so again, a reinterpretation of the Exodus for his own times. The early English colonists saw the journey to America as crossing the Red Sea. The Atlantic Ocean was the Red Sea. And America itself, they saw as the promised land of Canaan. And so what did that make the Native Americans? It made them the Canaanites. A couple of others, and then I'll quit. The Spanish monk and historian Jerónimo Mendieta saw the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés as Moses, and he saw the Spaniards as the Israelites. His contemporary, Bartolomé de las Casas, on the other hand, saw the Native Americans as suffering Israelites in need of deliverance from the Spanish, whom he saw as the Egyptians. And so you see two different Spaniards living at the same time, looking at the situation in the New World, see the roles of Moses and the Israelites completely differently. So then there are many other examples, certainly enslaved Americans, enslaved Africans, I should say, and their descendants in America saw America as Egypt, and they longed for a deliverance. And so the old spiritual called Go Down Moses was a plaintive cry for God to send them a deliverer from their suffering under slavery. And the Civil Rights Movement also, Martin Luther King, among others, used the image of the Exodus as a rallying cry for those who were in favor of the Civil Rights Movement. So I'm going to stop there. The questions, you have questions on the class website, and I want you to get into your groups, and as we've done before, and discuss these questions, and then we'll come back in a bit and talk about what you discovered and what you thought about these questions. Thanks.